Hi, welcome back to the Gem Hawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day. We have a little bit more sunshine in the UK today, so happy days. Today I want to share with you a design which I first taught in 2016, and it's for setting multiple cabochons in a long bar drop pendant. Now I've demonstrated this with as few as 2 pieces or cabochons and as many as 7. What I'm going to show you today is something very similar to this piece, and it's just a technique where you can use a long single piece of wire for the framework and then another section of wire to hold everything in together. Now they are quite stable. In a second tutorial, potentially coming up next week, I'll show you how to add some detail and interest to this same pendant using strips of woven wire. If you need to, you can check out my tutorials on wire weaving. Lots of different ways, and there really aren't any rules as long as you just think about your tension. You can do as many wraps around each piece of wire as you like. You don't even have to just use 2 pieces, but that's for next time around. For today, I want to show you how to generate a pendant which is a long drop down style, utilising multiple cabochons. So if you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you a little bit further. So a little bit closer at one of the demonstration pieces I have for you. This features a long triangle of rough seraphonite. In the centrepiece is a beautiful, quite small but beautifully flashy round labradorite, and then up at the top there's the most exquisite cushion rectangle of Indian rainbow moonstone. This is all captured together in silver plated copper, which is what I'll be working with today. So in terms of your materials, I'm using 18 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. In this instance, it's round copper with a silver plating. All I'm going to do is just grab hold of one end of the wire and just give that a bit of a smooth through, make sure there are no kinks that I will later struggle with, and get it just a little bit warm. So I have a random selection from my labradorite drawer. Here are some of the cabochons that I have available. So there are quite different shapes really. So I think what we might do is start down at the bottom with this beautiful oval cabochon of sunset labradorite, and I'm going to set that opposite to, we often see our oval cabs set in the portrait, but I'm going to set that today in the landscape because it will show you how to bring together the neck section of the design from quite a wide aspect. So the first thing we're going to do is to just take the centre of our 18 inches of wire, find the centre of that, and just start by chasing around to create our basic cabochon form. So it's reasonably symmetrical, this piece, so if it's easier for you, you can flip the design over. If you're working with unusual shaped designs, with unusual shaped cabochons, you would probably want to keep that in the single orientation. Now we don't want that to be too tight around the cabochon because we're going to be using a slightly heavier gauge of wire to wrap everything together. So my first idea is to get a good circuit around our initial, or the bottom-most of those cabochons, and just make sure that there's a good millimetre going around the edge so I can insert a little bit more wire later on and hold that securely into place. So that looks like there'll be enough of a gap. You can see some airspace there between the cabochon and the wire. I'm going to come in with my bent chain nose pliers. I'm going to turn the tip up towards me, and I need to make a bend so that the 2 wires come up on their own side. If you cross the wires, you end up with a bulky and uneven design. So I'm going to take the wire that's coming up on the right, and just to the 12 o'clock position, just to the right hand side of that, I'm going to create a bend. And I'm not going to be too harsh with it yet, because I haven't decided if that's the exact position I want to settle on. I'm going to switch that over and then do the exact same thing. So this is so it's easier for me to show you what I'm doing. If you're working with a fancy non-symmetrical, asymmetrical cabochon, you'll need to keep the wire still. So I'm just going to bring that up on the other side. Now there's quite a gap in the middle. That's really an aesthetic choice for you. You can have quite a close gap, or you can have a slightly wider gap. It will depend on the shape that you're starting off with and whether or not you want to see some space in there. Negative space is as important in jewellery as it is in art and photography. So if I just hold that quite closely, I think I've probably taken those ever so slightly wider than I want them to. So I'm going to show you now. Also, slightly closer on the right hand side than the left. If I flip that over, if you get to this point and you decide that your uprights aren't exactly where you want them to be, because we weren't harsh with that bend, I'm going to show you a little trick which I refer to as nibbling. So what we're going to do is just put the pliers into position and very gently just straighten that wire slightly, little by little. And then I'm going to move that bend over just a tiny amount. And you'll notice that it's done very little to the wire itself, but it has centralised that, and it appeals to my sense of symmetry for this particular cabochon. And what I'm going to do next is just, you can see that the wires, because they've come off a round spool of wire, they're crossing over. Well, for this design, I don't want them to cross over at all. So I'm very gently just going to open that out, draw my thumb along the wire, make that nice and warm, and I'm just going to roll that up ever so gently. If I flip the design over, I'm going to rub my thumb up the other side, introduce some heat into the wire, and then just roll that end ever so slightly around. Now you need to be gentle with the wire at this stage and make sure that if you're doing this, and this will just stop it from clanking on the ruler that I have up there out of shot. It's just so I know where to put my hands in shot a little bit later on. So if you're just tight for space, you can of course make sure that your wire is nice and warm before you put those in, but that will help you a little bit. What you can find is if you're a little bit clumsy like I am sometimes, that you might catch yourself on these parts here. So just make sure that those are nice and inside, and then hopefully you won't come to any mischief with them. So the next thing I want to do is get my first cabochon set into position, but I want to talk to you about the type of wire that I'm going to use today. So usually when I'm working on a cabochon and I've used a 1mm or 18 gauge for the frame wire, I will quite often utilise a 26 gauge or 0.4mm wire to tie everything together. Now for today, I wanted something that was slightly heavier, but not quite as challenging to my fingers. So a 22 or 23 is equivalent to around about a 0.6mm. That's just a little bit too heavy. So I found the perfect wire. I've got silver plated copper in 0.5mm round. It's not difficult to get hold of, and that's equivalent to 24 gauge. Now you can create this design using one great big 3.5 foot long strand of the 24 gauge or 0.5mm, but it can be very difficult to demonstrate with. So I have cut that into 3 shorter, more manageable lengths. If you do have the ability to keep that in one continuous length, all the better. The fewer cuts you have in any wirework pendant, the stronger it will be, the longer it will last. So if we go back down to the board, I'll show you how to set that first cabochon now. So I have here my first length of that 0.5 or 24 gauge wire, silver plated round again, and what I'm going to do is get this cabochon to sit nicely and neatly inside the framework. We're also going to tie that first little bit of neck together. So what I would probably do at this stage is decide how much space I want between my first cab and my second cab. You might want a really long drop, you might want to add some drama or beads in there. I'm just going to do a very simple back and forth figure of 8 weave on the neck here, and I'm going to keep that quite short. You can add a lot of drama by elongating the drops between the cabochons, and you can also channel set beads in there if you wish to, but for today we're keeping it simple. So my lighter gauge wire, I'm going to take about 1/3 of that, and I'm going to set aside that third. The whole length is around about 18 inches. So I'm going to take about 6 inches and use that to generate a little bit of basket weave in the neck section of the drop pendant. So I'm going to start with my finer wire underneath and have that crossing the long section, so 2/3 of the wire away underneath to the one shoulder. Now I'm right dominant, so I'm starting on the right shoulder. I'm going to wrap 3 times around the right hand upright of the neck. You'll see that this is already a little bit more challenging than 0.4 or 26 gauge wire, but it will be much stronger for one of the parts of the designs that I'll be showing you in a moment. So I'm going to draw those 2 sections quite close together and continue in a standard figure of 8 weave. If you've not met the figure of 8 weave, it's the workhorse weave, and it's what 90% of my bales start out with. So I have wrapped 3 times around the right hand side, and then I've swapped to the left hand side and wrapped another 3 times. It will be harder to get those coils to perform neatly just because the wire is ever so slightly stronger. So I'm pulling that down as low down to the neck section as I can possibly get, and then I will continue to do a little bit more figure of 8 weaving. I'm not going to over egg this because once you've seen how to do this a couple of times, it can get a little bit dull. So I'm just going to do another couple of wraps like so and pull that into position. I've gone for a symmetrical number, so 2 sets of 3 on either side basically. Now, if you were working with a single elongated piece of the lighter gauge wire, you'd have a significant quantity coming away in this direction, and you would have had 12 inches or so on the lower side. So this tail can represent, if you like, the remainder of the wire if you're going to work with one long section of the finer gauge wire. But for me, I'm going to trim that away because this enables me to demonstrate a technique to you without too much stuff falling off the table. So I'm just going to take the tail away there and neaten that up. This, if you're new to wrapping cabochons, is also a great way to not overcomplicate or overstress yourself. So the longer tail of that 18-inch section, we had that 12 inches on the lower side. And what I'm going to do now is just take this from point to point, and we're going to kind of replicate the middle cabochon that I've set on my existing bar pendant. I made that one yesterday as an example for you. So the finer gauge wire, as you know, is underneath the frame that we've created, and I'm going to draw a straight line to really any point on the loop that we have made as a frame for our cab. Just going to make sure that everything fits in there and it's all happy. So I'm quite happy with that. There's still a little bit of space. If you needed to, you could open this up ever so slightly. So the wire comes underneath, and I'm going to wrap that 3 times around the frame. Now what I'm doing here is I'm taking the leading wire edge and pushing that down into the centre. So that's twice around the edge and then a 3rd time. As long as you wrap it at least once all the way around and then back up, so you visually have 2 wraps, it's going to be secure. A single wrap and it will slip and come undone. I've gone for 3 because I've used 3 wraps further up in the design, and I kind of like the symmetry that that allows. So I'm just going to make sure that those are equal and that I'm happy with how everything is shaped. You do have the opportunity at this stage, if it's not quite perfect, you can make minor alterations. So I'm going to pop the cabochon in and over the top. And because our finer gauge wire started off going underneath the framework, what we've got is a nice secure housing inside that 1mm or 18 gauge wire frame. So I'm just going to go from point to point now, and I think I'm going to go 1/4 of the way around the edge. And I'm just going to lay the wire over the top of the cab to begin with. For my first wrap, I'm going to pull that cabochon back out of position, holding that in position. Now you'll see that this is domed, because we had the cab in position. We want to hold that so that it doesn't move around too much. And again, I'm going to take the leading edge, but this time I'm pushing it up and through, because we're going from top to top, and we're going to wrap again 3 times all the way around, pull that nice and firm, and then you can tighten up those wraps if you like. Now for the first time, I just remove the cab so you can see basically what we're doing. From now on, I'm going to keep that cab in position. So I'm going to take that wire across the back of the cabochon. We're now on the underside, and that straight line is going to come all the way across to the opposite side. So if you imagine that we went from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, underneath we're coming all the way back across to 3 o'clock. And what I'm going to do now is wrap 3 times around the frame wire. So there's a smaller gap just lower down, so I'm going to post the tail of the wire through, pull that into position, and we're going to wrap 3 times. So that's 1 and 2 and 3. Now to replicate where we started off with, what I want to do is bring the wire in a nice smooth arc down to the start position, back to 6 o'clock. Now to stop this all coming undone at a later date, I'm going to go to the far side of where we first landed. What that will stop from happening is from these little arc sections moving away and out. We're going to go over the top, and we're going to post up in between the cab and the frame, I'm going to do that quite slowly so you can see where the wire is going to. I'm going to draw that around, pull that nice and firm, and we're tying those two sections together. So again, up in between the cab and the frame wire, pull that nice and tight, and then back down, and you have the visual appearance of 3 wraps. You will want to take a moment to tidy that up like so. So you have the lower section of your cabochon is now nice and safe. Now with this design, if you make a mistake and you don't have enough wire, you can always add a little bit extra on. There are plenty of points around that framework where you can add extra. So what I'm going to do is just show you what the back looks like. We're starting to make a nice secure nest for the cabochon. So I'm going to draw that up, and because we've come across the back around the outside, I'm going to take the tail of the wire and post that wherever gap I can find. That's where it's going to go. I'm going to pull that nice and neatly once and twice and for a 3rd time. Tightening up those coils whenever you get to it. They don't coil as quickly or as willingly as your 26 gauge or 0.4. You just need to give them a little bit of coercion. Now you can be as fancy as you want with this. We could draw this over slightly to the side like so, and then wrap 3 times around on the far shoulder. So we'd go sort of from 1/10 to 1/2, something like that. Or you could draw that back up to the top, and then you could have almost like a draped curtain effect. So we bring the wire down over the top of our section that went from 3 till 6. So I'm going to take that over the top, around the outside, bring the tail of the wire in and wrap that like so. 1 and 2 and 3. Now let's have a look at the back. That's actually quite secure already, but if you wanted to continue, you can draw the wire up wherever you fancy. So we could add that across the back and then around. Let's just bring that up to the lower side, post that tail through, 1 and a 2nd and 3rd time, and then we will trim away. Now that gives us an asymmetric finish, however it's perfectly secure. If you wanted to add extra wire, it's very, very easy to do so. As long as you're always wrapping 3 times around the frame, it will look like it was supposed to be there. So just tightening up those coils, flip the design over. I'm just going to pull that nice and firmly into position and then open it out slightly so that I can trim that tail away inside the design, and then just push that tail up so that it's super neat like so. So if I flip that over to the front, you'll see that we have a perfectly housed and safe, secure cabochon wrap. You could add another section over to the side like so. You could add that if you wanted symmetry. We have a little bit left over. So I can do that for you now and show you how to add in extra wire. If you decide that you need extra, you can do that. So I'm going to lay my little scrap of the same gauge of wire over the top where I want it to appear. Pull up the tail inside the framework. So that's 1. And then push that tail up through again, 2. And once that's wrapped around at the back, that will look like the 3rd wrap. So I'm just going to support the wire, cut that away, and then chase that little tail so that it disappears into the design. So I'm going to use that like a rocker for a second, and then just push so that that snuggles away, and then your wire can straight, smooth wire. Use your body to get that thumb curve in, and then you can wrap around the edge. Now, if that additional wire wrap that we did earlier bothers you, you can always take that out. It's entirely up to you. So I'm going to give that a pull. 1 and 2. And then again, you take that just past, cut away, push that down into position, and then chase the tail away. So there's your first section done. I'll show you how to add another cabochon in just a second. So I've shown you what can happen if you don't use quite enough wire, how easy it is to add another section in. I'll show you now how to add a second cabochon before we come up to the neck, and then next week I'll show you how to add further detail to the design. So if we just refer to the example bar drop pendant, I've used some different shapes just to show you that it's exactly the same process when we're creating for rounds, for triangles, or for cushion rectangles. You're just creating a shape in the wire that's slightly larger than the form. If I put my finger underneath, you should be able to see there's a gap around there, but because the wires are crossing over, that's nice and secure, and I'm quite happy to show you the back of my work as well. It's neat enough. It's not as beautiful as the backs of many of my pendants are. You could concentrate if you wanted on making a nice star shape here by adding another cross. With the triangle, because it's such an uneven surface on that gorgeous rough seraphonite, I created a basket using that back and forth weave as we applied in the neck of the demonstration pendant, and it's just encapsulated the very tip of the design, and for me that's the safest way to protect an unusual gemstone like a rough gem, which may be more likely to receive damages. So that's how that one has been put together securely and safely. So for the next one, I'm just going to show you the beginnings of how to set that gorgeous Sunset Lab marquise shape. And then we will move on to creating a super simple bail. So I'm going to decide whereabouts I want the next section to flow out. You could of course do much more. We had some spare wire at the top there, so you could have a much greater length of distance between them, but I'm quite happy with these here. So because with basket weave you tend to have uneven sides, unless you're very careful with how you plan your wrapping, what I'm going to do is turn the right sided wire away first, and then turn the left sided wire away, and just make sure that I get those nice and symmetrical. Slightly higher up on the left, so I'm going to just nibble away like so until they sit symmetrically. So no matter what the shape is I'm going to add in next, I'm always going to start with these two right angle bends, because you will need to generate some space to encapsulate whatever shape. We could use this drilled, it's a drilled and faceted double-sided bead if we wanted to. You could even pop one of the wires up between and through. That looks about a 1mm hole, but it depends what you've got to hand and what you want to achieve with your design. So I'm going to pop that one back out of the way and then start creating that marquise framework. So I'm happy with where those bends have taken place. So I'm going to just very gently work harden those ever so slightly so that they stay solid. Quite like having the very point of that marquise nestling down into the top of the neck that we created just on the first section. So what I'm then going to do, because we only work hardened at the very edges, just where we created those angles, a little bit of warmth, and start stroking the wire into the shape that you want to achieve. So marquise can be a little bit tricky trying to get that symmetry, so you may need to use your pliers just to draw that together and get that perfect symmetry if that's what you're after. Very similar no matter what shape you're looking to use. So what I'm going to do here is I've made some nice smooth arcs, and I'm going to use my pliers to assist that angle until it starts looking to be around about the right kind of shape. To push the marquise down into position, remembering that we still need to have space around the gemstone. So this is far too tight where it crosses over, so I'm going to take my pliers just a little bit north of there, put a very gentle angle in to begin with, and if your wire is warm and you're gentle, you can have a couple of goes to make sure that that sits where you want it to. So I'm actually quite happy with those bends. I don't think they're too far off what I want to achieve. So I might take them slightly more southerly, take a nice sharp angle out to begin with, pop those two angles together, And then you can really see whether you've nailed it or if you need to adjust that slightly. So I'm really quite happy with that. So I'm going to use another one of my shorter pieces of wire, always remembering this is the type of design that you can add more wire to. So I'm going to ensure that I'm happy with the symmetry of those lines before bringing my two uprights to be actually upright. Unless, of course, you want to flare what is essentially going to become the bail out and add beads, which you obviously can do. So it's, again, really small movements, constantly checking your gems. I think that will work really nicely. So I'm going to do a section here of basket weave. Now, because I'm going to demonstrate with just 2 gemstones for this piece, because the middle one is almost the same as the top one. Basically, if you have got to the top, then you can start making a bail. If you want to add another one, you just repeat the same process. I'm just going to do the 2 stones for this particular piece. So because I want to have enough wire up at the top to make a bail, I'm going to straighten these wires out a little bit. Certainly a good 2 to 3 inches. Get them nice and straight, and I'm going to dedicate one of my sections of that 0.5mm or 24 gauge wire. She says questioningly. Yeah, it's definitely 24 gauge wire. And I'm going to dedicate the whole section to the bail. So I'm going to start, just going to leave a tail of a couple of inches, and then I'm going to start doing a little bit of that basket weave. Now this wire is stronger than you may be used to working with for weaving. It's not as hard as the 23 to 22 gauge, which is the 0.6mm, but it's definitely firmer to work with than the ones that I'm usually using, which is a 0.4mm or 26 gauge. So we're looking to create quite neat coils and just fill a good couple of inches when we get up to the top, so that we've got enough to make as fancy or as simple a bail as we like. So I'm just going to do a couple more wraps here. 1, 2 and 3. 1 and 2 and 3. I'm going to tighten those up. And then what you can see here, if you want to have a little bit more symmetry at the neck, with the tail of wire that we've got, I'm going to post that up in between those 2 uprights. And what I can do is 1 wrap and 2 wraps. Now, it depends on your personal level of symmetry, whether you want to have the same number of wraps on both sides or whether you want it to start in a similar position. So for me, I think I actually prefer to have 3 wraps on either side, and it doesn't matter if it's lower down on the one side than it is on the other. So I'm just going to trim that away and just squish that into position. So in a couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is continue up here. You've seen how to do the basket weave. You don't need to see me do that on repeat. You don't even need to see me doing that super speedy, because it's very, very dull. So I'm just going to do some weaving, and we're going to cut that out of the video, and I'll see you on the other side of this small time lapse. So I've just added some back and forth basket weave just up here, and we'll use that to create a bail once we've set our marquise cabochon. So the process for setting any of the shaped cabochons that you might like to use is pretty much the same. You're just tying the cabochon in position. Cabs are noted to have a domed top and a flat back. They do work exceedingly well when sat inside a frame like that which we've created today. Chubby beads, which are kind of domed on both sides, you might need to adapt the tutorial slightly. So there's quite a large gap around this one, so what we might do is just tighten this up slightly by pulling those uprights up and away. And you could even, if you wanted to, just take a little bit out of it at the top there. So it's a really nice and adaptable design, especially if you're new to wire working. It can be quite kind on kind of fixing any minor transgressions that you make. So we need to get that upright straight again, pop the cab back in. We've taken away some of that excess space to make sure that we're happy with the size of it. And because I'm going to use the entire length of wire, it doesn't really matter where we start and finish. So I'm going to take that and pass it underneath the framework we've created in the center of the length. And again, this is 24 gauge or 0.5 mil. So I'm going to stick with the 3 wraps. I'm going to take the right hand side first. You can either push the leading edge through the hole like so, or you can post the tail through the hole. You need to get into a rhythm of what works for you. I've actually done too many now. We're going to have 4 wraps instead, or you can push that back up and very, very gently just straighten that section. It's entirely up to you, whatever works. That's one of the things that you can get carried away doing anyway. So now we have the visual of 3 wraps. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the far side. So finer gauge wire coming underneath, push the leading edge through, or post the end through. And at this stage, before we start tightening those coils up and getting them super neat, we're just going to check that the cab still fits. It absolutely does. We could even tighten that up a little bit if we wanted to. So I'm just going to squeeze that gently into position and then draw it slightly closer together. So I'm just going to pull that ever so slightly to take away some of the size. And I'm now quite happy with how that sits. So what I think I might do is have my first little sweeping curtain type design over the top of the cabochon from the left hand side at 9 o'clock to just past the right hand side of the 12 o'clock position. So I would recommend putting the cab back in to make sure that you don't make it too tight a gap. Now we can fill some of this shoulder area up here. Whoops, that can happen. I just pushed that through. So I need to bring that back up, put my hand underneath the cabochon slightly more strongly, and then generate that coil on the right hand side of the 12 o'clock position. You may need to find inventive ways just to support that. Pull that all the way around and tighten up. And then check that your cab is sitting smoothly inside the framework with its flat back. So you can see that's slightly wrinkled, but luckily we warm our wire as we're using it so we can fix that. So again, equal and opposite over to the opposite side. You can manhandle the design a little bit, or woman handle it, or whatever handle it, just to make that do what you want. So I'm posting the tail up inside that frame, which is now slightly to the left of the 12 o'clock position, trying to get a sense of symmetry with the first section that we took. And then we're going to post that tail up through again, so we have the visual appearance of those 3 wraps. Pull that all the way around and then down across the back. So you'll take a little bit longer than I am doing right now just to get that neat and tidy, but you can see the idea that we're working on. Now, to stop this moving around too much, we're going to take the 2 tails we now have crossing at the back down to the low end of our marquise shape. So these 2 long straight lines will stop that swoosh from moving up and releasing the cab at the top. And it will also support the cabochon on the back to stop it falling out of the design. So again, around the frame wire, between the frame and the cabochon, and again the cab wants to escape. Pull that into position. And the reason I'm working with a heavier gauge wire is because this is a much lighter form of cabochon trapping. So we will actually want that to be quite heavy so that it lasts longer. Take that tail up and through. Pull that round into position. Now that's gone slightly awry because the wire's getting tired of me. So I'm going to pull that into position and then back over to the front. And we'll do the exact same thing on the far side. Now it might be easier for you if you prefer to look at the front. We're going to do the exact same thing but on the opposite side now, and I will tidy that up before the end. So we're going to coil around the framework, equal and opposite, and you can see again the wire's getting a little bit feisty. So that's once, take the tail around, twice, and then a 3rd time. Now because marquises are a funny slippy shape, what I would probably do in this instance is elect one of these wires to be cut away and the other one to just cross over the bottom. You could even do a double cross to make it nice and secure. So I'm going to pull that wire nice and straight. I just needed to sort that a little bit. What I'm going to do is 2 rainbow shapes, I think. So a nice little arc across the base of that marquise cab, like so. Hold that into position, and now the cabochon has got more passes of wire over and beneath it, it's less likely to be excited and start trying to fight you. So symmetry here, and wrap 3 times. Just going to cut the tail away so that it doesn't get on my nerves too much. And then exactly the same on the other side. So over the top in a little rainbow shape, and then wrapping around the frame wire. So I'm poking that up in between the frame and the cab. There's the first one. And there's the second one coming through. Try to keep it as neat as you possibly can, and then we would tuck that inside the design on the back. And if you had any areas that you were concerned about being vulnerable to escaping, you could take one of those tail wires and just wrap it across. I've obviously cut that already because it was getting on my nerves, but you could wrap that across the back and just add a second layer of security. So let me just clear the board slightly. Whatever shape you choose to add in, the key really is to allow a little extra space so that you can get whatever wire you choose to use in and around. Now, it is figglier to use that 0.5 or 24 gauge, but it is very much worth it for the longevity of your design. So I've just taken a few seconds to neaten the design up like so. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to create a very simple bail. And then in the next tutorial next week, we're going to add some extra bling onto the design, which both strengthens the features and also adds interest. So for today, I'm going to pop my bent chain nose pliers just above the topmost of my cabochons, however many you want to use. And I'm just going to push this back and away towards the rear of the pendant. You can make that sit exactly how you want it to. Now you can use bail making pliers if you have them available, or you could possibly use a paintbrush or a dabber or something similar. Depends what you've got to hand. So I'm going to look at the largest size on my bail making pliers and just roll that around super gently, not putting any stress onto that. That seems to work pretty well. So I'm just going to pop those back out of the way. Open up those 2 tail wires, which by now are seeing a little bit of work hardening, and just drop those so that they nestle around the neckline that we created. One of them I'm going to pull up and out of the way, and the other one I'm very simply going to wrap. Now I'm not going to pull super hard, because what will happen is the neck, or the bail rather, that you've created will go off to one side. So I'm just going to very gently draw that around so that it wraps just up at the top there. I'm going to do that once, and then on the second turn I'm going to trim away to about 1.25 inches, and then I'm going to find my round nose pliers and pop a little coil up on the top there. So again, starting quite close to the nose of the pliers, close to the end of the tail of the wire. Start generating your coil, and then you can draw that gently over the top of your, in this instance, marquise, whatever bead you have, whatever cab, sorry, you have in at the top there. Now your second tail of wire, you can take that around in the opposite direction, and I'm just going to bring that around one time, cross over onto the back of the design, and again I'm trimming to around about 1.5 inches, and I'm going to repeat the exact same thing, and in this way we're adding to the less escapability that you might suffer with a fancy shaped cabochon. So starting that coil, switching to the flat facing pliers, and then generating that coil carefully down over the back of the design. Now it doesn't have to go over the back of the cab, it could come back over the top of the bail, as I have done on this one. It's entirely up to you. They're both made using the exact same principle, but quite different designs because of the shape of the cabs that we've used. So that's how to set multi cabochons into a drop pendant. There's just 2 examples. They do make up reasonably quickly when you're not faffing around like I am today. And next time around, I'll show you how to add further detail to them, and hopefully your imagination will go wild and you'll be creating wonderful pieces completely to your own style. Thank you so much for continuing to join me here on the Gem Hawks YouTube channel. Have yourself a beautiful day. Bye for now.